Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What role can countries such as Italy play at the United Nations? What is Italy doing as a leader to focus attention on food security, climate change, and many other issues? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. The United Nations General Assembly has 193 member states. One of the most active is the country of Italy. Today we're going to take a look at the role Italy is playing at the United Nations. My guest today is an expert on this country. My guest today is His Excellency Ambassador Sebastiano Cardi. Ambassador Cardi was appointed as the permanent representative of Italy to the United Nations in September 2013. Ambassador Cardi currently serves as the chair of the United Nations Second Committee. Your Excellency, Ambassador Cardi, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for the invitation.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get in and talk about some of the great things Italy is doing, but let's talk a little bit about the Second Committee. The UN has 6 major committees, as I recall. The Second Committee you are the chair of for the 69th General Assembly. What is the Second Committee and what is your role as chair?
The Second Committee is probably the most fundamental committee out of the 6 of the General Assembly. It deals with the core mission of the United Nations, ending poverty, fighting hunger, fighting diseases all around the world, especially in countries, least developed countries. So our role as member states and mine as chair of the Second Committee is to try to give an impulse to all these very, very difficult challenges, especially in a moment, in a scenario in which we see many of the threats coming out in the international community. The threat of terrorism, of course, the threat of climate change, which is very closely related to the development issues. And so we have tried during the 2 main months of work, that was from September to December, to address these fundamental challenges that the United Nations and member states face. We have done so by creating a good atmosphere among member states, among all the various actors, which are of course the least developed countries that have a stake in that, and with the developed countries that have a stake and a responsibility to help these countries come out of poverty and embark on a path of economic development. And this is, I think, especially true now, which we are not talking only about ending poverty, but also how to help these countries, for example in Africa, where there is a huge economic potential, not only to fight hunger, where it still happens, but also to embark to take a road to the development, to real development, economic development.
Exactly. And how does the committee, you bring key players together on the Second Committee, you develop proposals, policies. How do they go to the General Assembly for their review and then hopefully implementation, and the idea is to put in play certain projects that will help alleviate hunger, provide food security and that type of thing? Yeah,
well, of course, since all the 193 members of the United Nations are represented in the committee, the idea is to discuss how it is best every year to advance the objectives and the goal of the organization in these particular fields that we have mentioned, which, as I repeat, are the core mission of the General Assembly. And the way we do that is to establish a dialogue among ourselves, among the member states, and then to try to build a consensus. Because if you have consensus, if every member states agree on the policy, then it will be much easier for the international community as a whole, for each individual government to put in place these policies and together to eradicate poverty, fight hunger, fight diseases. And for example, the food security issue is one of the most important. So really the idea is to build the consensus, to try to have the 193 countries working together to agree on some goals on how to bring them to operational level, and this of course in turn will make it easier for the beneficiaries countries to implement these policies, and for the donor countries such as the most developed countries in the world to help these countries fight poverty.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you're talking about food security, the production of food, and we see that the climate is changing. There's no doubt about it. I would bet probably in every country of the world it's changed to some degree, some way, shape, or form. And of course, that ties right into climate change and the whole issue of sustainable development that you mentioned a minute ago. How important is this for your committee and others too, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has done 5 reports, and many other groups, to focus on climate change as perhaps what many experts say is our #1 problem in the world today, the issue that's the most challenging to confront?
It is, you are right, because of course the climate change involves, catastrophes, weather, heavy weather, adverse elements. We have seen in the Pacific not long ago with a cyclone which struck many islands, and in turn this will have a big immediate impact on the capacity of these small countries especially to maintain the food production, for example. One of the Pacific islands struck by the latest cyclone, Pam, so I think 60% of the crops completely destroyed. So the issue there is to try to not only to devise policies to fight hunger, but also to adapt every country in the world, especially the most vulnerable to this new phenomenon, to adapt to this new changing scenario in the international, that have an impact, immediate impact on them, of course. And the climate, probably climate change is one of the most pressing issues we are facing. Some of the countries, for example, as I said, in the Pacific, they face possible, extinction by the raising of the sea level. Some of the countries, not only in the least developed world, but also in the developed world, such as Italy, we are experiencing extreme weather conditions, much more than in the past, melting of the glaciers. So every country, actually, not only the most vulnerable, we have to help them to overcome enormous challenges, but every country, even the developed country, must really take into account this enormous challenge.
Exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned Italy, because I was thinking every country in the world is experiencing some form of climate change. It's happening every place. We can't get away from it. The major conference, the next one, there have been several United Nations conferences over the years. I won't go back and revisit all of them, but the major one's coming up in Paris, the end of the year in December, early December. How important is it for the countries of the world to come together to set targets, really fixed targets that they could shoot for and lock in to try to achieve, if we're going to really develop a grand bargain to help combat climate change? We'll probably never stop it, but maybe we could slow it down or maybe reverse it to some degree. But how important is that conference?
The conference is really crucial, and I think the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, has showed the way. And he convened a meeting, a summit here in New York in September 2014, exactly to address the political will of the governments. Because I think, very rightly so, he said that without a political commitment from the leaders of the world, and all the leaders were represented, most of them were here, without a political commitment, there will be no chance to agree on, as you said, mitigation of the effects of climate change. We are not talking about reversing immediately the trend. We are talking about limiting to 2 degrees the change in the global temperature. So I think that this summit was very successful because it brought together the leaders, and all together they decided that in view of the Paris conference, the COP21, which will take place in December, they will commit to this, to the measures needed to limit the increase in temperatures in the next 80 years to 2 degrees. This in turn will have an enormous impact, beneficial impact, on the way adverse, weather patterns may affect, least developed countries and all the world, by the way.
Exactly. When we were talking about that, I was thinking of there are many reasons that people move, and climate change is one of them. When you see desertification taking place, but of course there are other reasons too: economic opportunities, perhaps political repression, civil wars, whatever. And I was thinking recently we've read a lot about, if I could shift gears, of the migrants coming out of northern Africa, and many of them are coming to your country, to Italy. What motivates people to leave their homes and to get, in many cases, rickety boats that you wonder how they are seaworthy to get from here 5 kilometers offshore, but they do that. What motivates them to do that, and what are Italy and the United Nations agencies and other groups doing to work with these folks and to provide assistance?
Well, the motivation, of course, is mainly conflicts, violence, which can be of various kind of nature. It can be, of course, human rights violations, human rights abuses. So we are seeing an increase in this flow of immigrants, of people, desperate people who seek a better world, who seek a better chance, who seek to live in a place where they can survive and survive in a dignified way. So we see that from Africa, of course, where unfortunately there are still conflicts going on. We see that from the Middle East, Syria, of course, Yemen. So the international community has a responsibility to help these people. First of all, to help these people. This is what Italy has been doing for a number of years already. This is for us a matter of rescuing people. There's been many deaths. You refer to tragedies, recent tragedies in the Mediterranean, close to the coast of Italy. We have been committed for years now to rescue, to help, to rescue people. We have saved, I think, last year more than 100,000 lives. 170,000 people arrived in Italy from the shores of the Mediterranean. So we are really committed to that, and together with the European Union, together with the United Nations, have a big role in addressing, first of all, the well-being of these people who run from poverty or conflicts or violence. We have to rescue them, first of all. But then, of course, we have also a responsibility to give them a better future. Also by addressing the root causes of conflicts, both in Africa and elsewhere.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view some of our previous shows. Also, we would encourage you to make recommendations for future topics and speakers. My guest today is someone who is very actively involved at the United Nations. He is someone who knows his country of Italy very well and plays a key role, especially as chair of the Second Committee at the United Nations. My guest today is His Excellency Ambassador Sebastiano Cardi. Ambassador Cardi is the permanent representative of Italy to the UN and chair of the United Nations Second Committee. Ambassador Cardi, we're talking about the inflow of migrants, and of course many of these migrants move into Italy and other areas too, and a large number of them move into cities. I know Italy has been very active at the United Nations in a wide range of topics. I get your press releases, and you have really some diverse topics that are very important and of great interest. One you did not long ago was on cities. I think you did it in conjunction with the UN Habitat Program. I may be wrong on that, but you were talking about social inclusion and how that is important in an urban area. What exactly did you mean by that as far as social inclusion in helping to develop urban areas to develop sustainably and peacefully too, I'm sure?
Absolutely. We are very involved in that. The studies show that by 2050 or around that time, nearly 90% of the world population will live in cities. So actually, if you think that cities will become the major emitters of pollution around the world, and they are also growing in size, because of the influx not only of people living in the countryside and wishing to go to the cities, but also, as you said, because there is a larger interest of people from other parts of the other countries. So the challenge there are to create cities that are sustainable, not only in terms of emissions, not only in terms of clean energy and clean air, so as to make our living more comfortable and more healthy, of course, but also in terms of how do you include all these new persons which maybe have different cultures, of different religious faith and so on. So the cities must really become more open. They have to think in the next 20 or 30 years to the challenges ahead. They are happening already, but they will increase in the next decades. And we really have to think about how to create the good environment to include both from the point of view of the services provided to the population, in terms of the health service that have to be provided to everybody according to their maybe faith or to their requirements. So it is really one of the most pressing challenges we are facing. And Italian cities, the biggest Italian cities, Rome, of course, the capital, Milano, Turin, and Florence also, are all giving a lot of attention to these very important problems that we are already seeing in a smaller scale today.
Exactly. And if our viewers would like more information on Italy and what you're doing at the United Nations, they can Google your office at the UN, or they can go to www.italyun.esteri.it and tap into your website and get much more information. I mentioned the various issues that Italy is involved in, and one that comes to mind is peacekeeping. We see that currently there are 16 United Nations peacekeeping missions. Several of them are in some very dangerous areas of the world, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and several others. How important are UN peacekeeping missions, and what role does Italy play as far as participating or being supportive of these missions?
Italy has been a traditional partner of the United Nations in peacekeeping. We have always provided a large number of troops, blue helmets, as we call them here at the United Nations. Italy is also, at the moment, the first Western country in terms of contributing troops to the United Nations peacekeeping operation. So we have not only a role, we also have a large and a long experience in peacekeeping. And we like in a year in which the peacekeeping operation and peace mission in general are reviewed by some panels here at the UN, to bring this expertise at the service of the member states. And by that, we mean that the world has changed. The threats are much more different now, maybe even more large and difficult to cope with. Think about the threat of terrorist networks. So the peacekeeping mission really must adapt to a new environment. They are more and more subject to threats, very strong threats, military threats, so they have to be better equipped. They have to be more efficient by having more intelligence, for example. They have to be in measure to use more technology. And Italy, by the way, an Italian company has provided the first unmanned aerial vehicles deployed in a peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo for civilian purposes. So we really advocate a reform, if I may say, of the peacekeeping operation to make them more capable of responding to today's threats, for example, responsibility to protect the civilians.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up, because in any war zone, we see many atrocities that have been committed. In fact, even in non-war zones, we see things taking place such as female genital mutilation. We see issues of human trafficking. We see wide ranges of human rights abuses of very vulnerable populations. How important is that for Italy and the other 192 countries of the UN General Assembly to focus on these issues and to, I know you have developed programs and really initiatives to help stop this or to reverse this process. How important is that?
It is crucial in our opinion, and Italy has been traditionally at the forefront of the human rights advocacy at the United Nations and around the world. And more often, unfortunately, we see, abuses on children, abuses on women. They are part of a wider instability in some countries, in some areas of the world, which involve, unfortunately, violence against women in conflicts. So we have to really pay a lot of attention to these issues, and we do at the General Assembly. And I must say that there is a lot of consensus from every country of the world that we have to unite. For example, through campaigns, very critical campaigns such as the one against female genital mutilation, which we are in part leading together with some African countries which are directly affected. And there is a level of understanding now of the phenomenon that I think gives hope that this phenomenon can be in some way, in some years, overcome. But certainly one of the most pressing challenges also, if you talk about migrations, and migration very often involve human rights abuses, during the course of this terrible, trip these desperate people undertake to a better place. So it is really a very, very high priority on our agenda and on the agenda of the United Nations.
Exactly. Do you think there's a consciousness raising taking place around the world with the, I know you can't gauge every member of the United Nations General Assembly, but it seems that there's more of an awareness today, and I don't know if it's because the media attention is on like female genital mutilation, if there's more transparency, more openness, more accountability, or what the situation is, but it seems like we're more concerned about this today than we were maybe 15, 20, 30 years ago. Do you find that to be the case?
It is the case, and rightly so, because I think this demonstrates very much the importance of the United Nations. The United Nations work cannot be measured in months or 1 year. United Nations work must be measured over decades, and especially in the field of human rights, advancement of the role of women, for example. Really, the United Nations have been the driving force that has created a consensus around controversial issues sometimes, because they involve cultural heritages in some countries and so on. And at the United Nations it was possible over the years to build that consensus, and that consensus in turn has translated into real policies at the level of government. So I really think that these example that you have mentioned demonstrate that in this particular field, the United Nations really can be proud of very important successes, very important advances.
Exactly. And while you were talking about that, I was thinking of the Millennium Development Goals, which you referenced earlier, and how they developed in 2000 on a 15-year continuum, these 8 logical, practical, measurable goals to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women. And those were really monumental goals. It strikes me because not only did they bring the United Nations General Assembly member states together, the UN agencies to all focus on them, but also brought in the private sector, non-governmental organizations that came to work on these goals to help achieve them. Faith-based groups, service clubs like Rotary International, Lions International, Optimus, Kiwanis, just we could keep going forever. But it really, these were really revolutionary goals to some degree. I mean, not to say they were brand new, but they at least brought the countries together, did they not? And all these other groups?
They did, and I think that was one of the major achievements also of the MDGs that now will be, translated in new SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. The fact that it was an innovative way of thinking development. Not only, specialized agencies, as you said, not only, the United Nations as a whole, but especially the fact that you are involving the civil society by looking at this problem through a holistic approach. You cannot fight poverty if you don't fight some cultural heritage, or if you don't help these countries in transition or least developed countries to build better institutions, for example, better functioning institutions. So everything has to be seen as a whole, as a same objective, and then with various sub-objectives. And one of the very innovative way of thinking development in the last few years, MDGs and now with the SDGs, has been the involvement of private enterprises, NGOs, civil society at the root level. And this has changed a lot the way we see development and the way we are able, and the governments are able to improve the situation on the ground.
Exactly. And as you've alluded to before, this is one of the advantages, in fact, the major advantage of the United Nations. It brings together all the countries of the world, 193 countries of the world, puts them together under one roof to deal with these problems and hopefully peacefully. Well, Mr. Ambassador, we're just about out of time. In the last 30 seconds, the hardest question, what do you see as our major challenge as we move forward into the 21st century? I'm sure there are many, but is there one that just comes to mind immediately?
We have many challenges, of course, and the fact that new challenges arise every day, terrorism being one of them. You know, the threat of terrorist groups is very, very important because it can impact on our development agenda, for example, you know, on the stability of major important strategic areas of the world. But we have to keep in mind that the United Nations has been here for 70 years. This is the 70th anniversary. And as I said before, you have to measure that over 70 years. And the advancement have been huge. We are going to continue on that.
Exactly. Well, Your Excellency, Ambassador Sebastiano Cardi, Permanent Representative of Italy to the United Nations, it's been fascinating to talk with you, and I've really very appreciative of the initiatives, and I know many other people are too, of the initiatives you've taken at the United Nations. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on Global Connections Television.